October 12, 1957. 7 p.m. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The numbers runners paid their tribute. The pimps kept their hands clean of uncut dope, and the shop owners paid for a piece the police department had long since stopped selling. It was Bumpy's piece, and the price was loyalty. Finley Finn Jones, his shadow and his shield for 15 years, stood a respectful 3 feet away, his gaze sweeping the street. Word from downtown, Bumpy, Finn said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. Charlie Lucky's boys are getting greedy again. That Genovese fella, he's sending feelers. Wants a bigger piece of the policy pie. Bumpy took a long, slow drag from his cigarette, the ember a tiny star against the encroaching twilight. Vito Genovese. The name was a stain, a low-country snake slithering uptown. Since his return from Italy, Genovese had been consolidating power, a brute force where men like Luciano had been artists of diplomacy. Bumpy had dealt with the Italians his whole life. It was a dance of mutual respect and carefully drawn lines. But Genovese didn't dance. He stomped. Vito thinks because he's got the commission by the throat, he can put a leash on Harlem, Bumpy said, the smoke curling from his lips like a prophet's pronouncement. He thinks this is just another burrow to be squeezed. He'll send his message, I'll send mine back. A negotiation. It's business. He flicked the cigarette into the gutter, the spark extinguished in an instant. He believed it. He believed in the rules, even among men who broke them for a living. He believed power respected power, that his dominion, earned with blood and brains, was a fortress. He could not have been more wrong. The message Genovese was sending wasn't written on paper. It was about to be carved into his soul. Bumpy looked at his watch. 8:30. Time to go home. He had read a chapter of Treasure Island to his daughter, Elise, every night for the past month, and he would not let Vito Genovese interrupt Jim Hawkins' journey to Skeleton Island. October 12, 1957. 9:15 p.m. Bumpy's residence, Astor Row. The brownstone on Astor Row was a world away from the grit of the avenue. It was Mamie's world, a sanctuary of polished wood, warm light, and the scent of pot roast. It was the one place Bumpy Johnson was not a king, but merely a husband and a father. He walked in, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing out the kingdom and its troubles. But the trouble was already inside. Mamie met him in the foyer, her face a mask of taut anxiety. The warmth was gone from the house. A draft of cold fear had blown through it. She's not home, Mamie said, her voice thin, brittle. Elise. She's not home. Bumpy's blood went cold. What are you talking about? She was at Cynthia's. Down the block. She was. Cynthia's mother called an hour ago. She said Elise left at 7:30, same as always. She should have been home by 7:45. An hour and a half. A lifetime in the geography of a child's walk home. Bumpy's mind, a machine of logistics and threat assessment, began to spin, but the gears were grinding, catching on something visceral and terrifying. This wasn't a gangster disappearing. This wasn't a runner skimming off the top. This was his little girl, his Elise, 10 years old, with her mother's eyes and a smile that could disarm armies. Did you call the police? He asked, the words feeling foreign and useless in his mouth. They said they can't do anything for 24 hours. Mamie choked out, a sob catching in her throat. They said she probably just stayed late with a friend. Bumpy's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew what they said. He also knew what they meant. A missing colored girl in Harlem was not a priority. It was a statistic waiting to happen. He walked past Mamie into his study, the room where he held court, where he signed checks that could make or break a man. He looked at the leather-bound books, the heavy desk, the symbols of his power. They were useless, totems of a forgotten religion. In that moment, he owned nothing. He was poorer than the poorest sharecropper in Georgia, because his treasure was lost. And then the two events of his evening, Genovese's demand and his daughter's disappearance, collided in his mind with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't business. It was a message. Vito Genovese thought bullying Bumpy was easy. October 12, 1957. 9:30 p.m. Bumpy's study. The king was broken. The fortress had been breached from within. Bumpy sank into his leather chair, the one that had always felt like a throne, and it swallowed him. He put his head in his hands, and a sound escaped his throat, a ragged, guttural noise of pure anguish he hadn't made since he was a boy who'd seen his brother killed. The carefully constructed edifice of Bumpy Johnson, the cool, calculating strategist, crumbled into dust. All that was left was a father. A terrified, helpless father. Finn let himself in the front door, having been summoned by a frantic Mamie. He walked into the study and stopped dead. He had seen Bumpy shot. He had seen him stand down a mob with nothing but the force of his will. He had seen him sentence men to their ruin with a quiet nod. But he had never seen this. He had never seen Bumpy Johnson tremble. Bumpy. Finn's voice was hesitant, soft. Bumpy looked up, and the sight struck Finn to his core. The king's eyes were wide with a terror that no street war had ever put there. They were red-rimmed, glistening. "He has her, Finn," Bumpy whispered, his voice cracking, shedding its armor of command. "That son of a bitch Genovese. He has my little girl. He has my Elise." He wasn't speaking to his lieutenant. He was confessing to his friend, a prayer to the only person who could understand the language of his world. All this, he waved a shaking hand at the room, at the house, at the invisible map of his Harlem empire. All this power, and I can't keep my own child safe walking 2 blocks home. What is it for, Finn? What in God's name is any of it for if I can't protect her? Witness testimony, Finley, Finn Jones. Statement recorded 1972. People talk about Bumpy. They talk about the cars, the suits, the power he had. They saw the gangster, the godfather of Harlem. And he was all that. I'd seen him face down shotguns without flinching. I'd seen him look a man in the eye and tell him he had 12 hours left to live. Cold as ice. But that night, in his study, talking about his little girl, that was the only time I ever saw the king bleed without being cut. He was just a man, a father scared out of his mind. He kept saying her name, Elise, Elise, over and over, like if he said it enough, she'd just walk through the door. Right then, I knew. This wasn't about territory or money anymore. This was about a man's heart being ripped out of his chest. And I knew whoever did it, they had no idea the hell they were about to bring down on themselves. You don't do that. You just don't touch a man's family. Not Bumpy's family. The phone on the desk rang, a shrill, violent sound that made Bumpy jump. Finn answered it. He listened, his face grim, then turned to Bumpy, a runner down by the docks. Joey squints. He says he saw a girl, about Elise's age, fits the description. Black coat, red scarf. Some Italian fellas bundled her into a car an hour ago down near Pier 45-inch. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Bumpy's despair. It was a false hope, a mirage in the desert of his fear, but it was all he had. "Get the cars," he commanded, the king's voice returning, forged now in the fire of desperation. "Get every man we have. Tell them to bring their hardware. We're going to the docks." October 12, 1957, 11:45 p.m., West Side Piers. The cars, for black Cadillacs, screamed down the West Side Highway, a procession of dark purpose. The Hudson River was a slick of black oil beside them, reflecting a cold, indifferent moon. Bumpy sat in the back of the lead car, a shotgun resting across his lap, his knuckles white. He stared out the window, his mind a maelstrom. He saw Elise's face everywhere, in the scattered lights of New Jersey, in the reflection on the glass, in the dark, churning water. He had built a wall around his family, a fortress of money and fear. He thought it was impregnable, but he had built it in a world of wolves, and he had forgotten that wolves are patient. They watch for the smallest crack, the briefest moment of vulnerability. A 10-year-old girl walking home from a friend's house. He thought about his own life, the choices he'd made. He'd left South Carolina to escape the brutality of the white world, only to build an empire on a different kind of violence. He'd justified it as control, as order. He provided for his community. He protected them from the junk that the Italians tried to pump into their veins. He gave men work. He was a pillar, a necessary evil. But looking out at the dark water, all his justifications felt like lies. The violence he courted, the darkness he navigated, it didn't stay in the streets. It seeped under the door. It had followed him home and wrapped its cold fingers around his daughter. He would trade it all, every dollar, every piece of his kingdom, to have her back. He would burn his own world to the ground if it meant she was safe. The Cadillac screeched to a halt near Pier 45. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel and rotting fish. Bumpy was the first one out, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape of shipping containers and darkened warehouses. Finn grabbed Joey Squints, the twitchy informant, by the collar. "Where?" "There," Joey squeaked, pointing a trembling finger toward a dilapidated warehouse. "Saw him go in there." They was Logan. Bumpy's men fanned out, moving with the silent, deadly efficiency of a wolf pack. They surrounded the warehouse. Bumpy nodded, and two of his men kicked the door in, splintering the wood. They flooded the space, guns up, ready for war. But there was no war. There was only a single flickering bulb illuminating a vast, empty space. In the center, huddled around a small fire in a trash can, were two men and a young girl. The men were drunks, not mobsters. And the girl looked up, her face smudged with dirt, her coat black, her scarf red. But her eyes were not Elisa's eyes. Her face was not Elisa's face. She was a runaway from Queens, terrified. The hope that had propelled Bumpy across the city evaporated, leaving a vacuum of absolute despair. It was a punch to the gut, harder than any fist. He leaned against the cold brick of the warehouse, the shotgun suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. The false alarm was crueler than no news at all. It was a glimpse of a rescue, a taste of salvation, snatched away. He was back in the dark, and somewhere in the city, so was his daughter. October 13th, 1957, 1 a.m. Bumpy's headquarters, the Capitol Club. The Capitol Club, usually a hub of jazz and high-stakes card games, had been transformed into a war room. The music was silenced, the gamblers sent home. The only sounds were the ringing of telephones and the low, urgent murmur of men given a singular, sacred task. A massive map of New York City was spread across 3 poker tables, and Bumpy stood over it like a general planning an impossible invasion. His face was a mask of gray exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. The countdown had begun. Every minute that ticked by was a minute scraped off his daughter's childhood, a minute she spent in the hands of monsters. "I want every year we have on the street." Bumpy's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear despite his fatigue. "Every junkie, every pimp, every numbers runner, every shoeshine boy. I want them listening. The bounty is $10,000. No questions asked. For the man who brings me the location. Not a rumor. The location. The sum was astronomical. It was enough to make a man risk the wrath of the entire Italian mob. It was the price Bumpy was putting on his daughter's life, and he would have made it $1 million if he could. His empire, once a machine for generating profit, was now re-engineered for a single purpose: search and rescue. Runners crisscrossed Harlem, spreading the word. Phones rang incessantly as his lieutenants coordinated the search block by block. Men who normally collected debts were now knocking on doors, showing Elisa's photograph. A school picture, her hair in 2 neat braids, a gap-toothed smile that now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. Finn stood by his side, a quiet pillar of support. He managed the incoming calls, filtering the noise from the potential signals. Nothing solid, Bumpy. A dozen sightings, all duds. People seeing ghosts for 10 grand. Bumpy didn't look up from the map. He was drawing lines, connecting dots, trying to think like Genovese. Where would he take her? Not to kill her. Vito wasn't stupid. A dead child would start a war he couldn't win. This wasn't about elimination, it was about subjugation. It was about breaking Bumpy Johnson, proving that his kingdom was built on sand. So, where do you take a king's daughter to break him? Not a place of comfort. Not a place of quick violence. You take her somewhere that would infect the father's mind with images of terror and despair. A place that would hollow her out. He traced a finger over the Bronx, then Queens. Genovese's people had properties everywhere, front businesses, shell corporations. Forgotten buildings in forgotten neighborhoods. Places where a child's scream would be swallowed by the urban decay, where the rats were bigger than the cats. His mind conjured images of Elise, alone in the dark, cold, frightened. The images were knives twisting in his gut. He had to stop them, had to focus. He was a strategist. He had to think his way out of this hell. October 13th, 1957, 8 a.m. The Capitol Club. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the cigar smoke that hazed the room. It was morning. She had been gone for more than 12 hours. Bumpy hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He was running on pure, uncut adrenaline and fear. He'd been over the map 100 times, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold the pen to cross off another search sector. The city felt impossibly large, a concrete labyrinth designed to hide one small, lost child. Mamie had called every hour, her voice getting thinner, more frayed each time. He had no news for her, no comfort. He was failing her. He was failing Elise. The weight of it was crushing. He felt a wave of dizziness and leaned heavily on the table, the map of his city blurring before his eyes. All his connections, all his power, and he was as helpless as any other man whose child was missing. More helpless, perhaps. Any other man could go to the police, could trust the system. Bumpy was the system in his world, and his system had failed. The enemy wasn't some random kidnapper. It was his own life, his own choices, embodied in the form of Vito Genovese. He looked at the faces of his men. They were tired, but they were loyal. They searched because he was the boss, but they also searched because they knew Elise. They had seen her at the annual Harlem picnic, a bright spark running through the grass. They were fathers and brothers and sons. They understood, but their understanding couldn't find her. Bumpy walked over to a window and looked down at the streets of Harlem waking up. People heading to work, kids walking to school. A world of normal, mundane life that felt a million miles away. He had always seen himself as the guardian of this world, the shepherd of his flock. But a shepherd who can't protect his own lamb is no shepherd at all. He was a fraud, a king of ashes. He closed his eyes and prayed, something he hadn't done in 30 years. It wasn't a prayer for forgiveness or for strength. It was just a name, repeated over and over in the desperate silence of his heart. Elise, Elise, Elise. October 13th, 1957, 2:30 p.m. The call came just as the last vestiges of hope were beginning to curdle into despair. It was from a flop house on 116th Street. The man on the other end was a junkie named Skeeter, a man whose entire existence was a desperate search for his next fix. The $10,000 bounty was, to him, a mythical treasure. "I know where she is." Skeeter's voice was a scratchy whisper, terrified of being overheard even on the phone. "I ain't seen her, but I heard. I heard some of Genovese's button men talking." Bragged Gin. Bumpy's heart hammered against his ribs. "Where's Skeeter? Where are they talking about?" "A building. An old tenement they own through a dummy corp. In the Bronx. East 149th. They call it the Forgotten Place. It's where they put things. Things they want to keep quiet. There was Logan about the little princess in the castle, said the king would be crawling to them by tomorrow. The Bronx. An old tenement. It fit. It was exactly the kind of place Bumpy had envisioned in his nightmares. A place of rot and neglect. A psychological torture chamber. "Is she alive, Skeeter?" Bumpy's voice was dangerously quiet. "Yeah, boss. They said she was. They ain't hurting her. They're just leaving her. In the dark. To break your nerve." Break his nerve. Bumpy felt a surge of rage so pure and cold it burned away his fatigue. They weren't going to break his nerve. They were going to forge it into a weapon. "Stay where you are, Skeeter. Finn will be there in 10 minutes with a down payment. The rest comes when my daughter is home." He hung up the phone. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. He turned to the room. "Finn, you're with me. Dell, Marcus, grab the long guns. We're going to the Bronx." October 13th, 1957, 3:15 p.m. East 149th Street, the Bronx. The building was a carcass. A brick skeleton with shattered windows for eyes, picked clean by poverty and neglect. It sagged between two other derelict structures, the whole block a testament to the city's indifference. The air itself seemed diseased, thick with the smell of damp plaster, decay, and the ghosts of forgotten lives. This was Genovese's message, written in brick and rot. "This is what I think of your world. This is where your princess belongs." Bumpy's Cadillac rolled to a silent stop a block away. He got out, Finn and his two most trusted men, Dell and Marcus, flanking him. They carried their weapons under long coats. There was no plan for a firefight. This was an extraction. Silent. Precise. "Two men," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady, the fear now transmuted into icy focus. Skeeter said 2 men downstairs, playing cards. "They're babysitters. Overconfident. We go in the back. Finn, you and I go up. Dell, Marcus, you are the welcome wagon." No noise. They moved through a debris-strewn alley, their polished shoes crunching on broken glass. The back door hung on one hinge. They slipped inside. The squalor was absolute. Piles of garbage, peeling lead paint, and the pervasive stench of urine and mildew. It was an assault on the senses. Bumpy's mind screamed, "My daughter is in here. My child is breathing this air." They found the stairwell. Dell and Marcus peeled off, melting into the shadows of the ground floor hallway, shotguns held at the ready. Bumpy and Finn started up the stairs, their steps impossibly quiet on the creaking wood. On the second-floor landing, they heard it, the low murmur of voices, the slap of cards on a wooden crate. The guards. They continued up. Third floor. Fourth. The building grew colder, darker. At the end of the fifth-floor hallway was a single door, its wood stained and splintered. A heavy padlock was latched on the outside. This was it. This was the castle. Finn produced a set of lockpicks, his hands steady. Bumpy stood guard, his hand inside his coat, wrapped around the grip of his .38. The only sound was the faint, metallic click of the picks working the lock. It felt like an eternity. Finally, a solid thunk. The lock sprang open. Bumpy took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find. He pushed the door open. The room was almost completely dark, the only light a sliver coming from a boarded-up window. The smell of dust and fear was overwhelming. And there, in the far corner, was a small shape, huddled into a ball. He stepped into the room, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was Elise. She was sitting on the filthy floor, knees drawn to her chest, clutching the worn, one-eyed teddy bear he had won for her at a Coney Island carnival. Her face was stained with tears, her dress was dirty, but she was physically untouched. He saw the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. She was breathing. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. "Elise," he whispered. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were huge and terrified in the dim light. She didn't recognize him at first. She just saw a large shape in the doorway, another shadow in her nightmare. She flinched, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. "Baby girl," Bumpy said, his voice thick with emotion, taking another slow step into the room. "It's me. It's Daddy." Her eyes blinked. A flicker of recognition. "Daddy." The word was a tiny, fragile thing, a bird's whisper. He knelt down, his expensive suit jacket soaking up the grime of the floor. He didn't care. He opened his arms. She stared for a second longer, and then the dam of her terror broke. She scrambled across the floor and threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her small body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. Bumpy wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his own eyes squeezed shut against the tears that threatened to fall. He breathed in the scent of her hair, dusty and afraid, and made a silent vow. Vito Genovese wanted to break his nerve. He had just signed his own death warrant. The near death he had inflicted was not on her body, but on her spirit, and for that, there was no forgiveness. October 13th, 1957, 3:20 p.m. The tenement. Downstairs, the card game ended abruptly. Dell and Marcus moved like ghosts out of the shadows. The two Genovese thugs never saw them coming. There were two soft, heavy thuds. No gunshots. No noise. Just the final, silent punctuation to their arrogance. Bumpy heard nothing, but he knew. He gently picked Elise up, her small frame feeling impossibly light. She clung to him like a life raft, her face still buried in his neck. He wrapped his large cashmere coat around her, cocooning her from the filth and the cold, from the world that had done this to her. "It's okay, baby girl," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "Daddy's here. We're going home." He carried her down the 5 flights of stairs, his steps sure and steady. He didn't look at the two bodies slumped in the hallway. They were nothing. They were refuse, part of the rot of the building. He walked out the back door and into the alley, where the weak afternoon sun felt like a benediction. Finn held the car door open. Bumpy slid into the back seat, never letting go of his daughter. As the Cadillac pulled away from the curb, leaving the carcass of the building behind, a new kind of coldness settled in Bumpy's heart. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. A purpose as clean and sharp as a shard of ice. He had his daughter back. Now, he would deliver his reply to Genovese. October 14th, 1957, 11 p.m. Palma Boys Social Club, Greenwich Village. Elise was home, safe in her own bed. Mamie was with her, and so was Dr. Collins, their trusted family physician, who had given her a mild sedative to help her sleep. The physical examination had confirmed it. No bodily harm. The wounds were all on the inside, in the quiet, terrified spaces of a 10-year-old's mind. Bumpy had sat with her until she'd finally drifted off, her small hand clutching his finger. Only then did he leave. He changed his suit, selected a fresh shirt, and took one gun, a Colt Detective Special, snub-nosed and businesslike. He told Finn to stay with his family. This was a personal visit. The Palma Boys Social Club was Vito Genovese's den, a storefront on a narrow village street that smelled of garlic and entitlement. The windows were opaque, the door was solid oak. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, was 1,000 miles from his territory, an invading army of one. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in. The room fell silent. 20 of Genovese's button men, capos, and soldiers stopped their card games, their conversations, their drinking. They looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and menace. They saw a black man, impeccably dressed, walking into their sanctum as if he owned it. They saw Bumpy Johnson, and for a crucial second, nobody moved. His reputation was a shield, more effective than any bulletproof vest. It was the armor of a man who had never, ever bluffed. Vito Genovese was sitting at a back table, holding a glass of red wine, a portly, bull-necked man with eyes like black stones. He saw Bumpy, and a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. He thought Bumpy had come to beg, to negotiate, to crawl, just as his men had predicted. Bumpy didn't slow down. He walked past the tables of soldiers, his gaze locked on Vito. The men tensed, hands moving toward hidden pistols, but they waited for a sign from their boss. The sign never came. Genovese was too caught up in his moment of triumph. Bumpy reached the back table. He didn't say a word. In one fluid, economical motion, he drew the Colt 38, reached across the table, and pressed the cold, round muzzle directly against Vito Genovese's sweating right temple. The gun kissed his head. The smile vanished from Genovese's face. The black stone eyes widened in disbelief, then in stark, animal terror. The wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The entire room held its breath. A pin drop would have sounded like a bomb blast. Bumpy leaned in close, his voice a low, lethal whisper that was for Vito alone. "You don't touch my family," he said, the words perfectly spaced, each one a hammer blow. "Not my wife. Not my daughter. Not ever. You wanted to send a message. This is my reply. The next time I see you, I won't say a word." He held the gun there for 5 long seconds, letting the cold steel transmit the full weight of his promise into Genovese's skull. He saw the man's nerve break. He saw the king of downtown reduced to a trembling slab of meat, his life held in the crook of Bumpy's finger. Killing him would have been an act of passion. This was an act of judgment. This was castration. Bumpy pulled the gun back, straightened up, and tucked the pistol neatly into his waistband. He turned his back on the terrified Genovese, the ultimate act of contempt, and walked out of the club. No one moved to stop him. He had walked into the lion's den, put his head in its mouth, and the lion hadn't dared to close its jaws. He walked out into the cool night air, the victor. But he knew, with chilling certainty, that he had just signed the warrant for his own freedom. A man like Genovese couldn't abide that kind of humiliation. He wouldn't come at Bumpy with guns. He'd come with something far more powerful, the United States government. October 15th to 17th, 1957. Bumpy's residence. The victory was hollow. Back on Astor Row, the war was of a different kind, fought in the hushed quiet of a little girl's bedroom. Elise was home, but she wasn't. The child who had left for her friend's house 3 days ago had not returned. In her place was a ghost who wore her face. She didn't speak. She barely ate. She spent her days staring at the ceiling, her eyes vacant. At night, she woke up screaming from nightmares she couldn't articulate, her body rigid with a terror that had taken root in her soul. Bumpy entered a new kind of hell. The helplessness he'd felt when she was missing was replaced by the agony of watching her suffer. His power was a joke. He could command an army of men, but he could not command the fear out of his own daughter's heart. For 3 days and 3 nights, he did not leave her side. He sat in a chair by her bed, a silent, heartbroken sentinel. Mamie would bring him food he didn't eat and coffee he didn't drink. He tried to read to her from Treasure Island. his voice soft and steady, hoping the familiar rhythm of the story would be an anchor. Pieces of 8. Pieces of 8, he read, but the words were just sounds. She didn't respond. He talked to her, telling her stories about when she was a baby, about the time she'd laughed so hard milk came out of her nose. He poured out his heart into the silent room, a confession of love and regret. "This is my fault, baby girl," he whispered into the darkness of the second night, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I brought this into our house. The world I live in, it's a dark place. I thought I could keep the darkness away from you. I thought I was strong enough. I was a fool." He was confronting the fundamental sin of his life. He had chosen to be a king in a kingdom of shadows, and the shadows had reached out for the only light he truly cherished. He saw it with blinding clarity. His life and her safety were mutually exclusive. As long as he was Bumpy Johnson, the ruler of Harlem's underworld, she would never be truly safe. The danger wasn't just from men like Genovese. It was in the very air he breathed, the life he led. On the third day, Mamie came to him, her face etched with a desperate resolve. "I spoke with Dr. Collins again," she said. "He knows a man, a specialist, a child psychologist. He says this is a trauma, a wound to the mind. He says the city isn't the right place for her to heal. The noises, the memories." She handed Bumpy a brochure. It was for a school in Vermont. A quiet, therapeutic boarding school nestled in Green Mountains, with horses and art classes and doctors who specialized in helping children recover from deep emotional wounds. Bumpy looked at the pictures of smiling children, of rolling hills under a blue sky. It looked like another planet, a world of peace and safety he could never give her here. The thought of sending her away was a physical pain, another amputation. But the thought of her staying here, a prisoner in her own mind, was infinitely worse. It was the only way. He had to send her away to save her. He had to cut her out of his world so she could have one of her own. "Okay," he said, his voice hoarse. "Make the arrangements." It was the hardest decision of his life, harder than any order he'd ever given. It was an act of surrender. He was giving up his daughter to save her from himself. November 5th, 1957. Federal Courthouse, Foley Square. The bill for his confrontation with Genovese came due, just as he knew it would. As Bumpy walked out of his brownstone, 2 federal agents in dark suits were waiting for him. They weren't NYPD. They were Hoover's men. The warrant wasn't for assault or threatening a crime boss. No one from the Palma Boys Club would ever testify to that. The charges were far more insidious, harder to fight. Conspiracy to distribute narcotics. It was a lie, a carefully constructed frame job. Bumpy had always kept the hard stuff out of his operations, seeing it as a poison that destroyed the community he profited from. But the feds, likely tipped off and fed manufactured evidence by a humiliated Genovese's political connections, had been building a case for months. The incident at the club just gave them the green light. Bumpy didn't resist. He held out his wrists for the handcuffs, his face calm, resigned. He had known this was the price. He had traded his freedom for his family's honor, for the right to look his daughter in the eye. It was a price he was willing to pay. As they put him in the car, he looked back at the house. He had already sent Elise away. She was on a train to Vermont, to a new life in the Green Mountains. He was on his way to a new life in a concrete box. It was a clean break, a necessary sacrifice. February 1958 to June 1968. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary / USP Leavenworth. The world shrank to the size of a 6-by-9-foot cell. The Rock was a cold, damp purgatory designed to strip a man of his name, his past, his very soul. They didn't call him Bumpy in there. He was prisoner AZ 1441. He was a number. But in the darkness of his cell, listening to the waves crash against the island, he was not a prisoner. He was a father writing a letter. Every single week for 10 years, he wrote to Elise. At first, the letters were one-sided, monologues of love and encouragement sent out into a void. He wrote about the books he was reading in the prison library, about the strange seabirds he could see from the yard, about his memories of her as a little girl. He never wrote about the violence, the despair, the crushing monotony of prison life. He built a world for her on paper, a world where her father was a thoughtful, distant man, not a caged king. And then, slowly, the void began to answer. First came a drawing, forwarded by Mamie from the school in Vermont. A horse with stick legs under a yellow sun. Bumpy taped it to the wall of his cell. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was proof that she was healing. Then came letters, written in a child's looping cursive. She told him about her classes, about her favorite horse, Aspen, about a friend named Sarah. She never mentioned the darkroom in the Bronx. The doctors were helping her build a new narrative, and Bumpy's letters, so full of normalcy and love, were a part of it. The years passed, measured not by seasons, but by the photographs Mamie sent. Elise at 11, smiling on a horse. Elise at 13, awkward and beautiful at a school dance. Elise at 16, looking confident and poised, holding a debate trophy. Elise at 18, in a cap and gown, her high school diploma in hand. Bumpy kept the photos in a worn envelope. They were his rosary beads, his connection to the life he had sacrificed. He missed everything. Her first dance, her first heartbreak, her graduation. He was a ghost at the feast of her life. Witness testimony, Finn Jones. Statement recorded in 1972. I went to see him, first at Alcatraz, then at Leavenworth after they closed the Rock. It was hard, seeing him like that. The government thought they had Bumpy Johnson locked in a box. They had no idea. His mind was in Vermont. Every time I saw him, the first words out of his mouth, before he even said hello, were "How's my girl?" He wasn't Bumpy Johnson, king of Harlem, in there. He was just a father, a skin about his daughter. His whole world was a 4x6 photograph of a girl he couldn't hug. He'd show me her report cards. Straight A's. He was prouder of that than any score he ever made on the street. He'd point to a picture of her smiling and say, "See that, Finn? That's my real legacy. That's the only thing that matters." He did 10 years of hard time. And he did it all for that smile. In his cell, Bumpy would trace the outline of her face in the photographs with his finger. He reflected on the nature of power. On the street, power was control, fear, money. It was a loud, demanding thing. But the power he felt looking at her picture was different. It was quiet. It was the power of sacrifice, of unconditional love. He had lost his kingdom, but saved its princess. He had traded a crown of thorns for a legacy of grace. He had made the right choice. July 2nd, 1968. Harlem, New York. The world he returned to was not the one he had left. Harlem in 1968 was a landscape of righteous anger and burgeoning black power, of dashikis and afros. The numbers racket was being pushed out by the state lottery. The heroin that Bumpy had fought to keep at bay had flooded the streets, a plague brought in by new players, including some of his own former rivals. He was released from Leavenworth, an older man, the lines on his face deeper, his hair flecked with gray. He was a relic, a ghost from another era. Finn was there to meet him at the train station. He was older, too, more weary. They embraced, a long, silent hug between two men who had been through a war together. The drive was quiet. Finn didn't take him to the old clubs or the street corners where he once held court. There was nothing for him there. The kingdom was gone. Instead, Finn drove to a quiet, respectable street in Hamilton Heights, pulling up in front of a clean, well-kept apartment building. "She wanted to be here when you got back," Finn said simply. Bumpy's heart, which had been steady through 10 years of prison, began to pound. He got out of the car and walked into the building, his steps hesitant. He climbed the 2 flights of stairs and stood before apartment 2B. His hand trembled as he raised it to knock. Before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door opened. She stood there. She wasn't the little girl of his memory or the teenager in his photographs. She was a young woman of 20, poised and beautiful, with her mother's eyes and a smile that was all her own. She was a student at Columbia, studying literature. She was whole. She was healed. The scar of her trauma was there, he knew, but it was a faint, silvery line, not a defining wound. It had not broken her. He stood there, speechless, a stranger in a worn suit, a decade of prison carved into his face. He didn't know what to say. How do you bridge a gap of 10 years, a gap of missed birthdays and Christmases, a gap of pain and sacrifice? He was her father, but he was also the cause of her childhood nightmare. She looked at him, her eyes taking in the tired man before her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. Then, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was a smile of forgiveness, of understanding, of a love that had survived the impossible. It was the smile from the photographs, but real, alive, and directed at him. "Hello, Pop," she said. The word. That one, simple word. Pop. It wasn't the formal daddy of a little girl, but the warm, familiar name of a daughter. It was absolution. It was redemption. It was everything he had spent the last 10 years hoping for. The iron control that had seen him through a decade in the worst prisons in America finally broke. Tears welled in Bumpy Johnson's eyes. And for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of pain or rage or fear. They were tears of grace. He hadn't saved his kingdom. He hadn't saved his throne. But standing in this doorway, looking at the incredible young woman his daughter had become, he knew he had saved his entire world. His legacy wasn't in the streets of Harlem. It was standing right in front of him,